Hey everyone, it's Raghu. I'm back with Mindrolling, and again, I say this a lot, but Anu Gupta is a new friend, about to be, shall we say? But I knew of Anu actually through Sharon Salzberg because you did a podcast there, right?
Yeah, I've done like maybe 4 or 5 with her
Oh,
for her last
really?
couple of books. Yeah, I think since her book Real Happiness came out a
Oh,
while ago.
oh, that's cool. Welcome, anyhow. Here we are.
Thank you for having me. It's such a joy.
Thank you for being here. Um, all right. Well, I'm assuming you grew up in India. and
Yes.
and knowing it more than assuming it. But can you talk about that? And because it's good to know how you came up and what all the struggles were.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's such a joy, because Ram Dass has been a good part of my journey.
Mm.
So it's nice to be speaking to folks who were his close friends and confidants, and also all the fans that are listening to our conversation. Yeah, so I am an immigrant to the US. So I lived in India until I was 10 years old. So I guess my formative early childhood, and then spent the remainder of my time since I was 10 to now almost 40 in the US. I've lived in a bunch of other places in the
And you have
middle.
no accent at all. So okay, that goes to show you 10 years. Where were you in
Well,
India?
I was in Delhi.
Oh,
I
really?
did have a big accent when I came in, and I still do actually. It's really funny. I was with a dear friend of mine a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco, and her son, who is really like auditorily like talented, and he was like, I don't know how to ask this, but it doesn't feel like you're from here. Like you have
Really?
a
Oh,
slight
no.
accent. And I was like, that was the most adorable thing. But yes, for most people who aren't as talented as him, Roman is his name.
Mm.
Yeah, I've adapted pretty quickly. And I think for me, so basically, I've been a student of Buddhism and Kriya Yoga, so very much in the Vedic tradition and the Hindu tradition. So my teacher is, Paramahansa Yogananda and the Self-Realization Fellowship tradition, and I was introduced to that tradition through my mother. So meditation and yoga has been a really big part of my upbringing.
Now, wait a minute now. I know a lot of Indian families because I've spent so much time there.
Yeah,
And a lot of family, their children are like not interested, would be maybe sometimes an understatement. They
yeah,
want what the West delivers, and India's, of course, in the big cities, that's
yeah.
happening a lot. So, okay, you had to talk about where you were at. I guess you're here in the States. You're a teen. Your mother is your influence, which that's another thing.
Yeah.
We didn't really have that kind of thing going on when I grew up.
Yeah.
My mother, it was a difficult childhood because she was going through all of her own issues. Father died when she was 10, that kind of
Right.
thing, traumas.
Yeah.
So to have a mom, you know what His Holiness the Dalai Lama says
Yeah.
about this our hope lies for the future of mankind with our mothers
That's right.
and the compassion that they could potentially transfer to us. He said, "Look
That's
at
right.
me. What you see this is from my mother."
Yeah.
So as soon as you say, your mom introduced you, but before, were you interested? I mean, what was going on inside yourself?
Yeah. Well, I think ever since I was a very young child, I was very spiritually inclined, and I was just, mesmerized with the idea of God. Before my mother, because when we were in India, my mom was very busy. She's a doctor, so she was a working woman, and we lived in a joint family. And there was another woman who was kind of a big influence on me. That was my grandma, my amma, and I talk about her in my book quite a bit. And she was a very devout Hindu woman, and she woke up every morning quite early, around 5 a.m. every single day to do her puja.
Mm.
She would be in front of her altar for an hour to an hour and a half, and oftentimes I would join her. So I really think about, you know, her gift to me was spirituality of, belief in this creator that's beyond just religious dogma. It's across faiths and across traditions. And, one little thing that I remember, and I've been reminiscing it. So I learned the Hindi alphabet, the Sanskrit alphabet, the same thing. Going to school, I was 4.5. I could read. And I remember there was a calendar in our living room in India, and it had the Gayatri Mantra on it.
Mm.
And something inside of me said, memorize this right now. And I was 4.5 years old. And
Wow.
I have no idea what that space was, but within, a minute or several minutes, I memorized the Gayatri Mantra, having read it. And then it's been kind of my source of comfort ever since. And of course, first learning a lot about the world, the material world that we're a part of, and then now unlearning for the last 15 years or so, and the journey continues,
Should let's do the mantra. So, I mean, there are people who potentially don't know. I found, where I found the mantra many years ago.
No,
I mean, I
sure.
heard it in India a lot, but I never paid attention. When I started to pay attention to it, Battlestar Galactica
Oh, that's
is
right.
the theme, the Gayatri, and I think it's it's one of the famous kirtanwalas that does it. Yeah, but do it.
Oh, sure. Okay. Om Pur Bhuvasva Tatsavitur Vareniyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yona Prachodaya. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Mm-hmm. That was lovely, Anu. Thank you.
Welcome. Yeah, thank you for that invitation. I don't think I've ever uttered it out loud, like particularly on a mic or a podcast before. So thank you.
Maybe say what it is too, so people can get it. I mean, we'll put the in the show notes. We'll put a link to this particular mantra. But yeah, can you? I mean, we're diverting when you hear what the book is about, but not really at all. Right?
Not at all. It's really about oneness. And I think Gayatri Mantra is one of the most divine and holiest of all mantras within the Vedic Hindu tradition. And Gayatri is a name for the Divine Mother, one of the many, many names, right? When we think about the creator, the spirit, the God in her feminine form. And this mantra is really one about, protect. It's asked for protection. Protect us as your children, as part of your creation, and also lead us towards self-realization, lead us towards you, towards our higher selves.
That's probably a mantra that we could all be doing quite often now, as of this new day and age, at least for the next 4 years.
Or the next 400 years or 4,000 years, right?
Or Yuga. Yeah, right. Oh, boy. So Anu put together and wrote a wonderful book called Breaking Bias, where stereotypes and prejudices come from, and the science-backed method to unravel them. I mean, look, I just referred to, we should do that. We should all be doing that, and the why of that suggests what this book does address.
Yeah.
That bias is there. Just, the divide on either side of the aisle, so to speak. That a big bias has grown up there. And it's part of what we're dealing with. So this is a very apt subject. Why don't you let us know how did this come together for you, related to your own life and stuff that you've gone through?
Yeah. So mention a little bit about my childhood. So of course, spirituality was a huge part of it, but it was a hidden part of it. I also come from a family with a lot of dysfunction. So particularly the men in my family. And as a result, I always found, curiosity among people. I grew up in Delhi, which is a really, really incredibly diverse place, ethnically, linguistically, gender, the whole gamut. But one thing I learned from a very early age was the distinctions based on class and caste. Caste was never a word I knew until I was actually in college in the US, but it was implied. The word is jati, really, in Hindi.
What is that again?
Jati.
Jati.
Jati, jati.
Jati, huh?
And so I just knew that there were some people that just had diminished status in society. I didn't know why. I was very curious, particularly growing up in Old Delhi, where there's quite a few of impoverished people, lots of beggars and folks without clothes. And
you grew up in Chandi Chowk?
I did grow up in Chandni Chowk, yes.
Jesus.
Yeah, so right across from the Gurdwara there.
Oh, really? I've been by there many.
Right. For anyone who's a fan of India, and but yeah, that was my upbringing in that, playing with monkeys and elephants and the whole gamut, in the 80s and the early 90s before I moved here. But after moving to the US when I was 10, kind of the tables turned and I became an untouchable of some sort because of my color and name and accent and way I dressed and walked. And I just, as a 10-year-old, I just didn't know what to do, right? So I just tried to assimilate as quickly as possible. And one thing that really got to me was in middle school, I was bullied quite a bit for being gay, anything that's just so gay. And, I learned English in India, and for me, gay is just happy, right? That was the association I had in my mind. And so I actually, one time I remember in the 7th grade, I went up to one of my bullies and looked him straight in the eyes, like, why are you picking on me for being happy? Like, what do you want for me to do? Just cry all day? And then he probably took some pity on me and told me to go look up the word gay in the dictionary. And I did. And that's when I really recognized that there is such a thing called same-sex loving people who are attracted to the same gender as they are. And I had felt that way about myself, but I didn't know if that was even a thing. So I was denying that. So I think there was a moment of delight that I felt that, wow, like what I feel inside, this thing, I'm like 12 years old at the time. And wow, it's like real, it's good. And it's like recognized by other humans. There are other people like me. And then suddenly I felt like, oh, because people sense this about me, I'm being bullied. Right. So I think for me, that's where the firefighter really went in and just wanted to sanitize everything about me so I could assimilate, and also to do what was expected of me, right? Both from my immigrant parents and my immigrant culture that I was a part of, community I was a part of, which was to succeed academically and professionally because they were struggling and because they had worked so hard to get us here. But also from the wider world that respected a certain kind of person who spoke a certain way, walked a certain way, looked a certain way. And for me, that meant like changing my name. I went by the name Andy for a long time. I, basically completely dispossessed my Indian culture publicly. Like I would outright lie that I was born here. I don't speak any languages. And I wouldn't even talk about my faith publicly. It was so important to me, but I just felt like it was something that people didn't understand and people actually abhorred. Like I was tortured quite a bit when I first came here for being a heathen, for being a pagan, for worshiping monkeys. And, I talk a little bit about this in the book. And so like the associations we have with yoga and Hinduism now weren't there, at least in the environments I grew up in. And I was actually teased and pretty brutally bullied for that. So I think I internalized a lot of that stuff and just kind of went my way, merry way, succeeded academically quite a bit. I was valedictorian of my high school, went to college. After college, I wanted to get away from America after doing some reflection, and I worked in human rights and economic development work in Myanmar, where I was introduced to Theravada Buddhism, working in monastic schools in South Korea, where I was teaching at a San Buddhist school as well as an English teacher. And kind of the spirituality piece was like really kind of filling this gaping hole within myself, which was just self-loathing. Like I just hated myself. I hated the way I looked. I hated my sexuality. I hated because I felt like it wasn't something that was approved of by my surroundings. I couldn't be my full self and authentic self. So, but with that said, continued on that achievement ladder until I was in law school. And I went to law school because I was working in a lot of impoverished communities around the world. And I wanted to do something. I wanted to serve. Like that's been kind of, Seva has been a big part of my
Mm,
life's journey.
mm,
Um, but in law school, for lack of a better phrase, shit hit the fan.
mm,
Because it's a pressure cooker environment, you know,
mm,
and at a prestigious law school that I was at, there was very little public recognition of bias. Even though we're reading civil rights, cases, and we're talking about gender equality and equity and the whole history of things. Um, and for me, like as someone who was feeling like the experiences of bias, and I started believing that maybe there's something wrong with me. Like I had some people say that why do you get so emotional about these things? And I was like, yeah, why do I get so emotional about these things? Maybe there's something wrong with me. And, right before I started my second year of law school, I found myself on the ledge of my 18th floor window about to jump off because I was
mm,
just at like the lowest of my lowest depression, anxiety, PTSD,
mm,
all the things, and just the pressure cooker of my life until that point too, as an immigrant. When we first came here, we lived in a studio apartment, like 5 of us. And like, basically that was my upbringing so my parents started to do better, right? They jumped classes after I went to college.
mm.
But like those formative years for me were really one of like struggle and scarcity. So that's how I felt inside. But at that moment when I was looking at the Midtown Manhattan traffic below me, something really magical happened, which I still don't, it's inexplicable. And, it's just a moment of grace. It's God and nothing else for me. I jumped, but instead I found myself in my apartment.
Wait, let's go back. You were on the windowsill looking out over
Yeah,
to the
and I
street,
jumped, and I
and you
jumped.
you remember jumping.
Yeah, and then but instead of falling forward, I fell back into my apartment. Yeah.
Pushback, maybe.
Yeah, who knows, right? The mind can have all sorts
Yeah,
of expectations,
yeah.
and I within that moment, I thought to call someone, and, it was the someone that I'd just met a couple of days before, but somehow I trusted her, and she lived quite far away from me, but she happened to be walking on my block, and she showed up in my apartment within 3 minutes. She just took the elevator up. She was in my neighborhood. She was literally, it was as if like, so she was like really my angel in that moment. And the next day I started my own breaking bias journey, my own healing journey, went to the counseling center, whole host of, interventions. And for me, that day was kind of like being born again because I was like, wow, I was just
Mm,
gifted.
wow.
And where I began to really look at and interrogate the nature of bias and how it affects me. Like I became a trained yoga teacher. My second year of law school, I did my internship for like half a summer, and then I went on a full, like month-long meditation retreat in Taiwan. Became actually a Chan Buddhist monk, for a month, like shaved my head and wanted to really understand the nature of my mind. And so that was my journey around addressing the suffering that I was experiencing. And then when I started working as a lawyer, I began to see that, we can fix all the policies that are out there, make them perfect, in terms of the crafting of the language. But until and unless we also shift hearts and minds, we're really not going to make any movement on issues of equity and belonging and inclusion. And I saw this in the courtroom where I was working, whether it was with the judges who were sentencing, mostly young, poor Black people to like inordinate amount of prison time for petty things like breaking cell phones or trespass to property, or like in the classrooms that I had been on, or in the boardrooms, or in the operating room with patients. So for me, it was like, wow, like this work is really about shifting hearts and minds, and just as I've been doing for myself, we
Mm,
need to bring it out there. And a lot of neuroscience at the time was showing that the tools I was using to heal myself and break my own biases toward myself are efficacious around breaking bias, particularly unconscious bias. So mindfulness, loving kindness, meditation, compassion, stereotype replacement, what I call prism tools in the book. So that's where something inside me said, oh, I need to take a pause from lawyering and really pull this all together in a, as an organization. So that's when I started my company, my organization Be More in 2014, and just been like doing a lot of research around it, funded by the National Science Foundation, training thousands and thousands of people in these tools. And writing a book was never something I wanted to do, but two things happened in 2020 and 2021. First was I got an opportunity to be on the Oprah conversation with Oprah Winfrey and the author Isabel Wilkerson around her book Caste. And that was like September of 2020. And I love the book and it's wonderful, but it diagnoses the problem of human hierarchies, whether they're in the US based on race, or in India based on caste, or Nazi Germany around religion or anti-Semitism. And then she basically beautifully lays out, well, how are these systems built? But she doesn't really give a solution. She says radical empathy, we need to develop that. How do we do it? Why do we do it? Up to us. Like she says, she's an inspector, like a building inspector. And that's when I was like, wow, like the tools that we need are the ones I've been teaching people. Mindfulness, stereotype replacement, compassion, but not just like talking about them in a intellect, but actually practicing them, feeling them, So moving from mindfulness to heartfulness to feltfulness, And but anyway, I put that thought aside. But then 4 or 5 months later, January 6th happened, 2021, and I just couldn't sleep for days. And that's when like the urge and the message to write this book really came, that I need to put together all of my research and my own life experiences and just really synthesize it in a way that people understand just the nature of hatred. Because that's what bias is. Nature of prejudice, nature of, and also give them the tools to transform it.
Didn't they just announce yesterday that January 6th didn't happen? I think they announced it. I'm being very facetious.
Well, part of it is like, that's just the nature, one of the things that really, for me, as I talk about the intellectual history of humanity and evolution of consciousness, in the book, I talk about this idea of exclusion consciousness that has been pervading through humanity during the Kali Yuga, right? And it's kind of an upward ascending cycle of human evolution. And the word that I actually use, the 3 defilements are really greed, hatred, and delusion from the Buddhist framework, which I love. But there's actually an indigenous word, an Algonquian word, that captures the nature of the problem, known as wetiko. And wetiko, wetiko. And it's basically the people of, the nation that we're a part of now, the original peoples of this land. This is the word that they use to refer to the early colonists. And not to the people, but that, they have this disease. They have this mind virus called wetiko, because it's so deeply rooted in wanting to dominate, to extract, and feeling separate from one another, from Mother Nature, from living beings. And that is the cause of the problem. And for me, as I study the history, and of course, as I write about it, wetiko isn't something just, central to Europeans or your early European colonists. It's a disease that could transfer. It's a mind disease. So we're all, with capitalism and the spread of the way it is, we've all become infected with this. So the aspiration for me around breaking bias is to really shift our consciousness, evolve our consciousness from exclusion, from wetiko to Ubuntu, to interbeing, to remembering that we are part of nature, we're part of this planet, we are connected to everything and everyone. And and the way we do that is really, the tools that first the Buddha laid out, Jesus laid out, Muhammad laid out, like all the great masters of the world. And our neuroscience is laying it out, right? Using different vocabulary. For me, that's where the opportunity is. And whatever people in political power, positions of power say, because they say it doesn't make it true. Right. And that's where we have to really take our agency. It's wetiko in action.
What's great is, I think, and you've talked about it in terms of, okay, people express this bias in so many different ways. They intellectualize about it, but what do we do about it? You know, and you can take diversity classes and so on. You know, you can do all of that stuff. But to me, it's absolutely what you referred to at the very beginning of this conversation is changing your own heart. Nothing can happen. You can read from here to forever, unless you take on practices that can go towards transforming oneself. It's very difficult. So what I love that you did in this book is really addressed it. You address, I mean, and I'm talking not just about different methodologies, which are all there, of course, mindfulness, meditation, all of that. But I'm talking about perspective.
Yeah.
We've got to realize, what is our perspective? Is it coming from the judgy me place, or is it coming from the heartful center of your being, Ram Dass, loving awareness place? And that was his main teaching at the end of his life.
That's right.
And so anyhow, you start addressing it with talk about primary identity. I mean, this is something, again, you're so in line with Ram Dass, spent so much time in his teachings around role and identity.
Yeah. I think he probably inspired me. I was inspired by this idea of thinking about, all of us as humans, we feel like we have so many identities, these roles and functions. We of course have our gender identity, we have our ethnic background, our age, our profession, our roles within our families as being a sibling or a parent or a child or grandchild, what have you. But all of these identities are actually our secondary identities. Our primary identity is what is something we all share, which is our sentience, our beingness as humans. Um, what I like to think of as our bodhicitta, right? So that's our primary identity, and this is what the Dalai Lama, has been a wonderful teacher and a what's the word? Like, not even a mentor, someone I look up to, someone I pray to every day, and I have been since 2011. Talks a lot about. That's kind of our primary identity, and once we acknowledge that, and all of the secondary identities we have, I was able to really see that, it's just three buckets. Our biological identities, which is basically how we're born, our body parts, our genetics, or what have our social identities, and these are identities that are assigned to us by our surroundings, this body, this form that we have. Whether it's our gender or our race or, our profession, these are assigned to us. And then our experiential identities, these are things that happen to us. Things like age, like all of us will age, all of us will get sick, and, some of us, live with chronic illness, and those become our experiential identities. Trauma is one of the experiential identities. If one is a survivor of war, one is a survivor of abuse or rape or something, right? These become part of our identities, but that's not who we are. And that's where I think, for me, being able to wrap up all this stuff in just these clean frameworks really helped me understand just the nature of identity, but also how we identify with our identities. When all of the great wisdom traditions say that we have to unhook. Identification is what keeps us hooked in, right? So, and that's kind of the invitation, that we don't forget about the harm. We actually don't. We actually have to acknowledge it. We have to bring it into our loving awareness, the harm that was caused to me, or I caused others. But we don't have to remain in it. We don't have to marinate in it. We can actually move forward. And that's really the invitation.
I think that what's super important that you do elaborate on is samskaras, basically mental formulations, and intertwined with one's karma in a life and an incarnation. I think this has to be really investigated through mindfulness, meditation, contemplation,
Right.
very much so, because you can talk about it. The mental concepts and mental habits, the neurotic tendencies, all of that development, it's not so easy to abandon them because we are so, as you said, attached, and they feel good. Like
That's
if you
right.
don't have that thing, it doesn't feel good because it's completely, it's new, and we don't want new, and we don't want to know about change either. So yeah, talk about that.
No, I love that. I mean, sanskars are something that I first learned about this from my grandma, actually, my maharaj-ji,
Oh yeah.
uh, when I was very young. And it was just like I was a hazy concept to me until I really started practicing meditation on a regular basis. And I think about like in my own tradition, my guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, just talks about the importance of meditation, how it's one of the most vital things we need to be practicing in order to both actualize ourselves and our full potential, but also to, be one with the creator, if that's our aspiration in this lifetime. And the more I've reflected on it and studied the lessons and also evolved in my own spiritual growth, I see why. Because what meditation, particularly um, practicing the tools that we've been given, whether it's anapana, whether it's insight, whole host, right? It depersonalizes what is happening and takes us to that place that we actually are, our primary identity, which is loving awareness. So then we can see the ego. We can see that small self that is petty, that is cruel, that is stuck. And not only that, for me at least, when I began doing that, I started feeling compassion for this
Mm.
ego being that I have, because he is living with so much fear and so much hurt and so much pain that it almost feels like, oh my gosh, I want to bring your pain into my loving awareness. And I want to help you heal. Let's talk about it. Let's be like, Rumi has this beautiful poem about the guest house,
Oh,
right? What pains, what depressions, what sadness you have. Oh, welcome. Let's have tea together. And that's, I think, for me, what the invitation of meditation really is. And mindfulness is a tool we practice in meditation. There's so many different tools we can practice. And samskaras are these, mental formations, which are really habits of thoughts, habits of emotions, habits of, reactivities. Um, but I'll tell you, Raghu, like the person I am today is so different from the person I was 5 years ago.
really?
And it's on the other end from 15 years ago when I started meditating on a daily basis,
Mm.
like such a different person. And that is kind of the beauty of what neuroscientists are now showing as neuroplasticity. And so we all have that potential, but what's required really is, I think, at least two things. One is like will, like we have to have the motivation and the determination to be better. That has to come from within. But I think for me, what's helped the will is faith, Shraddha, and Shraddha is even the Buddhist or the Hindu kind of cosmology is kind of a prerequisite. Like you have to not believe that there's something out there, but you have to believe that there's potential for change, that there's hope.
Or just believe in the true, deep down goodness that is
Exactly.
your real identity, as you're saying.
That's right.
You're talking about using will. That gets touchy because if it's that judging thing, forget about
That's
it.
right.
Ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful there. But I did a podcast with Rinpoche, Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche.
Mhm.
And he wrote a book called, uh, that's right here, Diligence. And I said to him, as soon as you say that word, every one of us here in the West is going to cringe. What? What are you putting on me? What do I got to do? That kind of a
Right.
thing. And their translation for it is taking joy in every action. Taking joy. It's about joy. It's not
Yeah.
about, I'm going to tell you better do this, bad person. And if you're not, on it, then, you're lost. So that's why, I love that you went into it a little bit more deeply around the mind. I love this. Scientists estimate that on average, we have 60,000 thoughts a
Mhm.
day. That sounds like a lot, That
Yeah,
sounds like an awful lot. And that gives you, or gives all of us a little bit, um, we have to have respect. It is quite a proposition to, unhook from this stuff. It's really, and that's why, and people say meditation, well, I tried it, but I have all these thoughts, I can't, it's not for me,
yeah,
and I say to them, you are expressing what everyone who ever sat down for the first time.
that's right.
It's everybody. Everybody thinks that. It's bullshit. It's just more stuff. And then, of course, what you just said, one needs to use a little bit of willpower or diligence. Put the joy in there too, right?
Yeah, I think the word, at least in the Pali Canon, it's virya, energy, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
as you were saying, and I was like, oh yeah, this is kind of my conundrum too. I'm like, because I was trained in critical thinking, right, as a lawyer in particular, and always contingency planning, and then I read Alan Watts's book, one of his original ones, and he said that words are what are going to get us in trouble because it's
Mm,
so wedded to words, and
yeah.
because it's not about the word. It's just the word is like, just as our finger is pointing to the moon, but the finger doesn't become the moon. The word is trying to capture a certain state of being, mental and emotional being. And so for me, it's like use whatever word one needs to really access what's going to help us really alleviate our own suffering. And then of course, once we do that, naturally we'll also want to alleviate suffering of others.
Mhm. Yeah. I want to get this book you mentioned actually. I thought it was interesting. It's from an economist, Daniel Kahneman. Is that his
Yeah,
name? Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Um, Around habits, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which to me
Thinking fast,
is,
thinking slow. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's primary
Yeah.
is unhooking from habits. And, neuroscience is telling us you can do that. You can create new habits, that are,
That's right.
much more fulfilling. So what was this thinking fast and slow? Oh, it's a behavioral, economist.
Yeah.
What is a behavioral economist? That's incredible too.
It's a subset of I mean, I would say it's more psychology, but because he has his PhD from in economics, he was able to kind of combine those things and why rational actors act the way they do in, you know, economic senses. But the book really, for me, it was helpful. And because it's kind of entered the everyday vernacular for a lot of people, I wanted to
Mm.
use this analogy that he so beautifully proposed. And it fits so well with the Buddhist mind sciences that I use as the
Oh yeah,
foundation book,
yeah.
where he really talks about that we have two ways of making decisions. There's system one thinking and system two thinking. And system one thinking is just the automatic reactivity, you know,
Hmm.
you know,
The one we're in most of the
yeah,
time.
right, the one we're in most of the time. And these are sanskaras. These are sanskaras. These are the mental formations that have been
Mm.
hardwired into us. If my mom speaks to me this way, I speak back in this way, right? If I experience pain, this is what I do, to cope with the pain.
Yeah,
Oh, if I feel depressed, I go for that you know, extra serving of dinner or a glass of wine or whatever. So these are just like our system one ways of being.
yeah.
And then system two is more methodical, more deliberate. That's where we bring in awareness. And that is where we're responding to things. We're not reacting, but
Mhm.
we actually acknowledge the fullness of. who we are, what the situation is, and using wholesome and skillful ways of being to respond. And that's basically what his thesis was, is that we can operate from system two thinking. And for me, it's like, oh yeah, this is what breaking bias is about. Because, the way I define bias is it's a learned habit. It's a learned habit that distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. And it's not our fault, right? Like, there are 5 causes of bias that I go deep into the book, and it's been wired into us by the media, by education, by our social surroundings, our social contact, through policies, and then, of course, false stories. Um, but we could loosen their hold on us through practice of mindfulness and other tools. And
Yeah. And you do
that's,
say, you talk
yeah,
about bias results from this system one thinking, which is that draws on past experiences, patterns, mental shortcuts, concepts, emotions, and habits to make rapid judgments without conscious effort.
that's right. That's right.
That is, everyone, we can take a look at how we do that just walking around. Ram Dass's famous thing, you go through a forest and you see thin trees, fat trees, beautiful foliage tree, every tree. You don't make any kind of judgment in your mind about any
Tree
of
is a
it,
tree.
Yeah. But people and, oh my God.
I think, not I think, I know this to be a fact. This is a product of modernity. This is not how every human being in every culture around the world has been. But this is Wetiko. This is how this consciousness has spread. We've been trained to judge, It's a part of, I think for me, and the good news really is the Kali Yuga is over, and we're in an ascending cycle of human evolution. It's a 2,400-year-long cycle, and we're into year 300. But this is why the work that you're doing, the ways you're engaging audiences to come back to consciousness, to come back to presence, is so important. The work that I've been doing is this is the role we're playing to evolve consciousness,
Yeah.
become aware.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big job, everybody, but we got to do it, especially in light of, the Kali Yuga got a little darker.
Yeah. But also super fulfilling, right? Like when we are in the presence of love, when we're in the presence of joy and compassion, it just feels good. I don't know. For me, it does.
I would say that's true.
And that's
But
Ramdas was in that space all the time, right? For the vast majority of the time, he was in that that state of ecstasy. I've been listening to a book, The Gospel of Ramakrishna. Excellent book. And
The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is one of our books back when we were in India in the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, what a fabulous book. And like a lot of those masters that like I'm just thinking about Ramakrishna, I'm like, he was just in divine ecstasy all the time.
In Ram Dass's case, he was not in ecstasy all the time. Not. He was absolutely. The beauty is, you could say, well, Ramakrishna was in this, gone beyond state and going into deep, deep samadhi trance. Ram Dass, actually, he became what Neem Karoli Baba had said to him, Ram Dass, love everyone and tell the truth. And that's when he said, the truth is I don't love everyone. It took an arc over decades and decades till he got to Maui. It took a stroke. Okay. I mean, really tough stuff, as you can imagine, for him to actually embody that. So in that way, he was in ecstasy because he actually embodied it. Everybody who was around him knew. And a simple thing, giving full attention to everyone who came into his sphere, full on attention, not diverting, nothing, not picking up a cell phone, zero. and being able to just completely be there, which he did with me the first minute I met him, in the late 60s. And so to me, that's a real ecstasy, actually.
That's right.
Yeah.
What a gift that you had so much time with someone like him, right? Who had that full arc of an experience. But I think for me, it's ennobling and inspiring that it's possible for all of us. And for those of
Exactly that. Ram Dass was not a guru.
that's right.
He was a teacher. He is a teacher still, because as we keep sharing everything of his.
Yeah.
But again, that somebody. Yeah, Bob, Bob Thurman? You must know who Bob is, right? Yeah. We love Bob. He was with us in one of our retreats when Ram Dass was still alive in Maui. And Ram Dass, I don't even think, Ram Dass was in the audience, I think. And Bob went on about, look, this is our first American saint, okay? And he did that because of that foremost ability to want to share with other people, want to do something outside of me into the collective we. And that is, that's the bottom line, no matter what state of consciousness you're in, right?
Yeah. That's right. It's so beautiful. And that's where I find hope in these times, because there are so many people doing just that, and at least in the South Asian lineages, that's why some people are karma yogis and some people go into Raja Yoga and some people go into more the bhakti route, and they all play a place and they're suited for different temperaments, right? So for me,
well, that's the beauty of being human, right? Well, just we don't have much time left. I was really, again, when I said this in the beginning, I was really happy that you delved into that identity in the mind and all of that. I mean, it's very familiar material because of Ram Dass, but just giving everyone, and right at the beginning, giving this sense of there is work to do, absolutely.
Right.
And none of this is going to get transformed until each one of us makes some effort in that way. But talk a little bit about sorry about that.
No worries.
My mic just skipped out on me. But talk about unconscious bias. I mean, I think conscious bias, most of us have a good idea of that because we've all done it. Unconscious bias, talk about that.
So, both are learned habits, right? So conscious biases are learned false beliefs, basically believing that there's genetic basis for race, false, that there's, men make better leaders than women, false, right? So these are false beliefs.
Yeah.
And then unconscious bias are learned habits of thoughts. So that distort, again, how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So these habits of thoughts are how, again, the sanskaras, how we've been trained to perceive ourselves and one another. So for me, that, from an internalized bias perspective, because of the upbringing I had after I moved to the US and just the exposure I had from the media to the education to my social surroundings, I started believing the lies about, people that look like me or the person that I looked like, right? And that's unconscious. A lot of it wasn't happening, like someone wasn't teaching me. There was, of course, conscious bias too, but I was learning it subliminally, in the curriculums and the books that I was reading. Like there was no representation of someone like me, or if there was, it would be represented as an evil person. Temple of the Doom, the villain is eating monkey brains. And I'm like, I was raised vegetarian. What are you talking about, right? But that's what all my classmates thought Indians did, right? And so that's kind of where unconscious bias really becomes. And the cool thing for me was that, scientists have discovered ways to measure it. the strength of it and how it impacts decision making. And oftentimes unconscious bias is what's, driving the car. So, when we think of a surgeon, who do we think of? I have a riddle in the book, in the gender chapter around this. And my mom is a surgeon, and, she thinks of men. She
She
doesn't think
thinks
of,
what?
she thinks men, right? She doesn't think of women as surgeons, right? At least
Mm.
when she did the riddle. But the cool thing is, once her unconscious bias became conscious, that's all you need. The light of awareness is already shown on it. Change has already happened. So it's really hard to unknow it. And I think that's where the invitation and the opportunity lies for us. And this is why this work is for all of us to do, for those of us who work in media, for those of us who work in the law, those who work in medicine. We are basically surfacing the guk, the wetiko, the exclusion consciousness of the past several centuries, and we're transforming it through our, words, thoughts, and deeds. And that, I think for me, that's what we're called here to do.
Through our consciousness.
That's right.
I mean, it sometimes can get a little difficult. If you have a great mindfulness practice, for instance,
Yeah.
you can really, that's not the judgy thing up there. You can really see your motivations. You can see your thought projections. You can see the story that you've developed around whatever it may be, and that can be disconcerting. I mean, in myself over time, I have seen it and have felt that just a little bit of darkness around, wow, this is so embedded, it's knee-jerk reaction that, wow, so you have to have patience and compassion with yourself because of it.
Yeah, that's right. That's where you bring in the dose of compassion and the hard practices that are so important. I will say that it's also really painful and harmful, right? So in the healthcare industry, for example, and I work a lot in there, patients of color receive lower doses of pain medication, like, they get amputated for diabetes like 3 or 4 times more than lighter skin patients. So like there are these associations that impact at an unconscious level because these doctors aren't, I believe most doctors aren't waking up in the morning to be like, I'm going to be the most biased doctor today, but it's conditioned.
Yeah.
This is samsara. So part of it is like for us to wake up from that, for us to really kind of transform our own hearts and minds. And for those of us who are on the receiving end of it, and we all are in some shape or form, because we all have so many different identities, some dominant, some subordinated. That's where we practice compassion for ourselves. It's so important.
Compassion is a good note to end our podcast on. My, oh my.
Yeah.
We will, in the show notes, we'll give you some links, certainly, of course, the link to the book, which came out towards the end of last year, I believe.
That's right.
And of course, the work that Anu's been doing. And boy, this is such an important thing. I mean, we have addressed it as an organization, Love, Serve, Remember organization. We've addressed it and related to just inclusiveness with everybody that's coming to help us share the teachings and so on. So I think would go a long way if people really, really started to look at inside themselves at the divide.
Yeah.
Because that divide is, that's the same divide is the bias that you have against yourself when you start speaking in a way you would never talk to another person the way you talk to yourself. I often say this. That's a bias right there.
That's internalized. That's what it is. And I think for me, the invitation really is that we can't do this work alone. That's why being in community, in communities that are safe, where we can make mistakes or compassion, we lead with compassion is so important. In the book, I have those 5 shared agreements in the beginning for a reason, because we have to practice this stuff. This isn't something that we're going to learn. It's not a head-based thing. It's really a full body-based thing. It's a somatic experience that's rooted, and we really lead by with our hearts.
Mm.
So yeah, I feel like thank you for doing the work, and yeah, I'm just excited to continue.
Thank you for doing this. By the way, here's the cover of the book. It's got a foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You see, I have a lot of pages that I've marked off.
Yeah, and if folks are interested, please join my Substack. I write about this on a weekly basis.
Oh, yeah? Oh, okay, great. Well, yeah, let's maybe share that with me, and I'll share with the people who do the show notes and all that. And it will all be there on Mindrolling. Go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling, or just go to Be Here Now Network and see, like Sharon did a wonderful podcast around this book. And that actually, I should give credit to Raj Agarwal, right? Who I think that's how I got introduced to you, actually, in the very, very beginning. And that's the good fortune of a kind of family we have and share through this podcast network. So thanks so much for being here, Anu.
Yeah. Thank you. May all beings everywhere be happy. May they be free of suffering.